we. She included herself among the wise ones, just as Egwene and Elaine included themselves among Aes Sedai. Well, he said lightly, I expect Sora Leia at least believes I should have my ears
Hey,
boxed.
OG, how you doing?
Probably Bear does too.
Hope you're doing
Certainly
well.
Elaine. Among other things, she mumbled. To his disappointment, she pushed away from him, although keeping a hold on his coat. They believe many things I could wish not. He grinned in spite of himself. So she did not believe he needed his ears boxed. That was a pleasant change since waking. Adnan Kadir's wagons lay a mile or so from his tent, circled in a broad depression between two hills where stone dogs kept watch. Colored coat straining nosed Darkbone looked up, passed with his banner and loping escort. Moraine was there as well, examining the wagon where the door-frame Tirangreal was lashed under canvas behind the driver's seat.
Give me 1 second, I'll be right
She did
back.
not even glance around until Kadir spoke to her. By his gestures, he was plainly suggesting that she might want. In fact, he appeared sort. Himself had nearly torn, while Kadir sweated his way through 3 handkerchiefs. Rand would not regret it if Kadir managed to sneak off in the night. The Aiel guards had orders to let him go, so long as he did not try to take Moraine's precious wagons. More obviously ever, their loads were a treasure to her, and Rand would not see her lose them. He glanced over his shoulder, but Asmodean was staring straight ahead, ignoring the wagons altogether. He claimed to have had no contact with Kadir since Rand captured him, and Rand thought it might. Certainly the merchant never left his wagons, and was never out of sight of Aiel guards except when inside his own wagon. Opposite the wagons, Rand half drew rein without thinking. Surely Moraine would want to accompany him into Cairhien. She might have crammed his head full, but it always seemed there was another piece she wanted to fit in. And this once in particular he could do with her presence and advice. But she merely looked at him for a long moment, then turned back to the wagon. Frowning, he heeled the dapple on. As well to remember she had other sheep to shear than he knew about. He had become too trusting. Best to be as wary of her
Oh, shit.
as of Asmodean.
That's crazy, OG.
No one, he thought bleakly. For an instant, he did not know in mind how vultures lay around there among clouds, squawking hoarsely at glossy ravens that tried to usurp their rights to the dead. Where Aiel went across the treeless hills, recovering the bodies of their slain,
See how long the
birds
stream
wandered
goes.
aloft fatly, screeching protests,
Let me try to share it
then
out.
settled again as soon as the living humans were a few paces gone.
Using my
Vultures and
GoPro.
ravens and flies together could not really have made the sunlight dimmer, yet it seemed so. Stomach twisting, trying not to see, Rand heeled Jadden faster until Avienda clung to his back once more and the maidens were running. No one protested, and he did not believe it was only because Aiel could maintain that speed for hours. Even Asmodean looked pale around the eyes. His face never changed. The bright banner whipping above him appeared a mockery in that place. What lay ahead was little better. Rand remembered the foregate as a raucous beehive, full of noise and color.
Oh, not a fan of cold.
Now it was a still, thick band of ashes surrounding the square gray walls.
I
of
just bet
Cairhien
God,
on
the only
three
thing
sides.
I know how to
Charred timbers
somewhat
and
use
easily
it.
atop stone foundation.
Grower has his.
Yet stood, sometimes tilting precariously. In places, a chair lying somehow untouched in the dirt street, a hasty bundle dropped by someone fleeing, a rag doll emphasized the desolation. Breezes stirred some of the banners on the city's towers and along the walls. A dragon standing out red and gold on white at one place, the crescents of Tyr, The middle set of the Jangai gates stood open.
This one is
Three tall square arches in
the
gray
Hero
stone,
9.
guarded by tyrants and rimmed helmets. Some were mounted, but most afoot, and the variously colored stripes on their wide sleeves showed they were retainers of several lords. Whatever was known in the city about the battle being won, and Aiel allies coming to the rescue, the approach of 1,000 Farder Mai created some little stir. Hands went uncertainly to sword hilts, or spears and long shields, or lances. Some of the soldiers half moved as if to close the gates, even while looking to their officer, with 3 white plumes on his helmet, who hesitated, standing in his stirrups and shading his eyes against the sun to see the crimson banner, and more particularly, Rand. Abruptly, the officer sat down, saying something that sent 2 of the mounted Tyrans galloping back through the gates. Almost immediately, he was waving the other men aside, calling, "Make way for the Lord Dragon Randall Thor! The light illumine the Lord Dragon! All glory to the Dragon Reborn!" The soldiers still appeared uneasy about the maidens, but they formed into lines to either side of the gates, bowing deeply as Rand rode through. Aviendha sniffed loudly at his back, and again when he laughed. She did not understand, and he had no intention of explaining. Him was that however hard Tyrans or Karienen or anyone else tried to puff up his head, on her and the men at least to take the swelling down, and Egwene and Moiraine, and Elaine and Nynaeve for that matter, if he ever saw either again. Come to think of it, the lot of them seemed to make that a large part of their life's work. The city beyond the gates stilled his laughter. Here the streets were paved, some broad enough for a dozen or more large wagons abreast, all straight as knife cuts and crossing at right angles. The hills that rolled outside the walls were here carved and terraced, faced with stone. They looked as much made by men as the stone buildings with their severe straight lines and sharp angles, or the great towers with their unfinished tops, surrounded by scaffolding. People crowded the streets and the alleys, dull-eyed, hollow-cheeked, huddling beneath makeshift lean-tos or ragged blankets rigged as tents. And the dark clothes by Karienen city dwellers, and the bright colors of foregaters, and the rough garb of farmers and villagers. Even the scaffolds were filled, on every level to the very top, where folk looked tiny for the height. Only the middle of the streets remained clear as Rand and the maidens made their way along, and that only for as long as it took the people to surge out around them. It was the people who stilled his mirth. Worn and ragged as they were, jammed together like sheep in a too small pen, they cheered. He had no idea how they knew who he was, unless perhaps the officer's shouts at the gates had been heard. But a rang ahead of him as he circled through the streets, the maidens forcing away any words except for the occasional Lord Dragon, when enough shouted it together. But the meaning was clear in men and women holding up their children to see him pass, in scarves and scraps of cloth waved from every window, in people who tried to push past the maidens with outstretched hands. They certainly seemed to have no fear of Aiel, not at the chance to lay a finger on Rand's boots, and their numbers were such, the pressure of hundreds shoving them forward, that some managed to wriggle through. Actually, a good many touched Osmodian's instead. He certainly in all his dripping lace, and perhaps they thought the Lord Dragon must be an older man than the youth in a red coat. But it made no difference. Whoever managed to put a hand to anyone's boot or stirrup, even Pevins, wore joy on their faces and mouthed Lord Dragon into the din, even as maidens forced them back with their bucklers. Between the clamor of acclaim and the riders sent by the officer at the gate, it was no surprise when Mylan appeared. A dozen less tyrant lords for retinue and 50 defenders of the stone to clear his way, laying about the butts of their lances. Gray-haired, hard and lean in his fine silk coat with stripes and cuffs of green satin, the High Lord sat his saddle with the stiff-backed ease of one who had been put on a horse and taught to command it almost as soon as he could walk. He ignored the sweat on his face, and equally the possibility that his escort might trample someone. Both were minor annoyances, and the sweat likely the greater. At the end, the classic lordling, who had come blood, was among the others, not quite so plump as he had been. So his red-striped coat hung on him. The only other Rand recognized was a broad-shouldered fellow in shades of green. Simon had liked to play at cards with Matt back in the Stone, as he recalled. The others were older men for the most part. Displayed any more consideration of the crowd they plowed through than Mylan. There was not one Karianan in the lot. The maidens let Mylan ride through, and Rand nodded, but closed behind him to exclude the rest, a fact the High Lord did not notice at first. When he did, his dark eyes smoldered angrily. He was often angry, Mylan was, since Rand had first come to the Stone of Tyr. The noise began to abate with the Tyrant arrival, fading to a dull murmur by the time Mylan made a rigid bow. We're into the city now. And clear. And befitting. Bad one, Rand said, and the other man blinked. As you say, my Lord Dragon. He went on after a moment, his tone making it clear that he did not understand. If you will accompany me to the royal palace, I have arranged a small greeting. Small indeed, I fear, since I had no warning of you. Yet, by this even, I will make sure. Arranged now will.
Hey, Ozart, how you doing?
A bow and a thin, oily smile for reply.
Hope you're
The
doing
fellow
well.
was all subservience now. And
Let's do a little
he would be
dab out of my,
talking as to someone too feeble-witted to understand facts held under his nose. But beneath it all lay a contempt
Luca
and hatred
Dragon Egg.
that he believed Rand did not see, although they shone in his
Turn it on
eyes.
first.
Contempt because Rand was not a lord, not truly, as Mylan saw it, by birth. And hatred because Mylan had had the power of life and death before Rand came, with few his equal and none his superior. To believe that the prophecies of the dragon would be fulfilled someday was one thing. To have them fulfilled, and his own power diminished by them, was quite another. There was a moment of confusion before Rand made Sulin allow the other Tyrant lords to bring their horses behind Osmodian and Peven's banner. Mylan would have had the defenders clear the way again, but Rand curtly ordered that they follow behind the maidens. The soldiers obeyed, faces unchanging beneath the rims of their helmets, though their white-plumed officer shook his head, and the High Lord put on a condescending smile. That smile faded when it became clear that the crowds opened up easily ahead of the maidens. That they did not have to club a path through, he attributed to the Aiel reputation for savagery, and frowned when Rand made no reply. One thing Rand made note of, now that he had Tyrans with him, the cheers did not end again. The royal palace of Tyr occupied the highest hill of the city, exactly in the center, square and dark and massive. In fact, between the palace, in all its levels, and the stone-faced terracing, it was hard to say there was a hill there at all. Lofty colonnaded walks and tall, narrow windows, high above the ground, did no more to relieve the rigidity than did gray, stepped towers, precisely placed in concentric squares of increasing height. The street became a long, broad ramp leading up to tall bronze gates, and a huge square courtyard beyond, lined with Tyrant soldiers standing like statues, spears slanted. More stood on the overlooking stone balconies.
Yeah, read that right.
A ripple of murmurs ran through the ranks at the appearance of the maidens, but it was quickly stilled in chanted shouts of, "All glory to the dragon reborn! All glory to the Lord Dragon and Tyr! All glory to the Lord Dragon and the High Lord Mylan!"
I don't know what it is about this one.
Mylan's expression, you would have thought it all
compared to
dark-garbed servants.
This one,
the first Karianan
this one,
Rand had seen in the palace.
It makes me cough a lot more than this one does.
And white linen cloths, as he swung a leg over the high pommel and slid from his saddle. Others came to take reins. He took the excuse of bathing his face and hands in cool water to leave Avienda to climb down by herself. Trying to help her down might have ended with them both flat on the paving stones. Unprompted, Sulin chose out 20 maidens besides herself to accompany him within. On the one hand, he was glad she did not want to keep every last spear around him. On the other hand, he wished Nyla, Lamel, and Samara were not among the 20. The considering looks they gave him, especially Lamel, a lean, strong-jawed woman with dark red hair, nearly 20 years older than he, made him grind his teeth while trying to smile reassuringly. Somehow, Avienda must have managed to speak to them and to Sulin behind his back. I may not be able to do anything about the maidens, he thought grimly as he tossed a linen towel back to one of the serving men. But burn me if there isn't one Aiel woman who'll learn I'm the Kahar Karn. The other High Lords greeted him at the foot of the broad gray stairs that led up from the courtyard, all in colorful silk coats and satin stripes and silver-worked boots. It was plain that none were aware Mylan had gone to meet him until after the fact. Potato-faced Torian, oddly languid for such a lumpy man, sniffed anxiously at a scented handkerchief. Wayam, oiled beard making his head seem even balder, clenched fists the size of small hands, and glared at Mylan even as he bowed to Rand. Simon's sharp nose seemed to quiver in outrage. Marakan, with blue eyes, rare in Tyr, compressed his thin lips until they
One of my
almost
dogs has got some bad gas, man.
And while Hearn's narrow
The one he
face
did
was
that,
all
that was a
smiles,
stinky one.
he tugged unconsciously at one earlobe, as he did when furious. Only blade-slender Arakom showed no outward emotion, but then he almost always kept his anger well-banked until ready to let it burst into flame. It was too good an opportunity to miss. Silently thanking Moraine for her lessons, it was easier to trip a fool than to knock him down, she said. Rand clasped Torian's pudgy hand warmly and clapped Gwayam on the point of a thick shoulder, returned Hearn's smile with one warm enough for a close companion, and nodded silently to Ericombe with a seemingly significant glance. Simon and Marakan he all but ignored after one look as flat and cool as a deep winter pond for each. That was all it needed for the moment, beyond watching their eyes shift and faces thought. They had played Deus de Mar, the game of houses, their entire lives, and being among Kylieni, who could read volumes of eyebrow or a call, had only high activity. Each man knew Rand had no reason to thank him, but each had to wonder if his own greeting was only to cover something real with someone else. Simon and Marakan appeared, yet the others eyed those two perhaps the most suspiciously of all. Perhaps his coolness had been the true cover, or maybe that was what they were meant to think. For himself, Rand thought that Moraine would be proud of him, and so would Tom Maryland. Even if none of these 7 were plotting against him at the moment, I did not think even Matt would bet on. Men in their positions could do much to disrupt his plans without being seen to. And they would do so from habit, if for no other reason. Or they would have. He had them off balance now. If he could keep them that way, they would be too busy watching each other and too afraid of being watched in turn to trouble him. They might even obey for once without finding 100 reasons why things should be done differently than they wanted. That would be asking too much. His satisfaction increased when he saw Asmodean's sardonic grin, Avienda's wondering stare. She had been in the Stone of Tyr. She knew who these men were, and why he had sent them here. I do what I must, he thought sourly. I wish it did not sound as if he were trying to excuse himself. Inside, he said, more sharply than he intended, and the 7 High Lords jumped as if suddenly recalling who and what he was. They wanted stairs, but except for Mylan to show the way, the maidens simply made a solid circle around him. And the High Lords brought up the rear with Asmodean and the Lesser Lords. Avienda stuck close by, of course, and Sulin was on his other side. Samara and Lamel, and Anyla right behind him. They could have reached out and touched his back without stretching. He gave Avienda an accusing look, and she arched her eyebrows at him so questioningly that he almost believed she had nothing to do with it. Oh. The corridors of the palace were empty except for the dark-liveried servants who bowed almost chest to knees or curtsied just as deeply as he passed. But when he entered the Grand Hall of the Sun, he discovered that the Carianan nobility had not been excluded from the palace entirely. "The Dragon Reborn comes," intoned a white-haired man just inside the huge gilded doors, worked with the rising sun. His red coat embroidered with 6-pointed stars in blue, a little large on him after his time in Cairhien, marked him for an upper servant of Mylan's house. "All hail the Lord Dragon Randall Thor! All glory to the Lord Dragon!" A quick roar filled the chamber to its angle-vaulted ceiling 50 paces up. "Hail the Lord Dragon Randall Thor! All glory to the Lord Dragon! The light illumine the Lord Dragon!" The silence that followed seemed simple by comparison. Between massive square columns of marble, thick-streaked with blue so deep it was almost black, stood more Tyrans than Rand expected. Ranks of lords and ladies of the land, dressed in their finest, in peaked velvet hats and coats with puffy striped sleeves, in colorful gowns and lace ruffs and close-fitting caps, intricately embroidered or sewn with pearls or small gems. To their rear were the Carianan, darkly garbed except for slashes of color across the breast of gown or knee-length coat. The more stripes and house colors, the higher the rank of the wearer. But men and women with color from neck to waist or lower stood behind Tyrans clearly of minor houses, with yellow embroidery instead of thread of gold and wool instead of silk. No few of the Carianan men had shaved and powdered the front of their heads. All of the younger men had. The Tyrans looked expectant, if uneasy. The Carianan faces could have been chiseled from ice. There was no said who cared and who not, but Rand suspected most of those cries had come from the front rows. "A good many wish to serve you here," Mylan murmured as they made their way up the blue-tiled floor with its great golden mosaic of the rising sun. A ripple of silent curtsies and bows followed. Rand only grunted. They wished to serve him? He did not need Moraine to know that these lesser nobles hoped to become greater on estates carved out of Cairhien. No doubt Mylan and the other 6 had already intimated, if not promised, which lands would be whose. At the far end of the Grand Hall, the Sun Throne itself stood centered atop a wide dais of deep blue marble. Even here, Cairhienan restraint held, for a throne at any rate. The great heavy-armed chair glittered with gilt and golden silk, but somehow it seemed to be all plain and vertical lines, except for the wavy-rayed rising sun that would stand above the head of whoever sat on it. That was meant to be him, Rand realized long before reaching the 9 steps to the dais. Aviendha climbed up with him, and Osmodian, as his bard, was allowed up as well. But Sulan quickly the other maidens around the dais, their casually held spears blocking Mylan as well as the rest of the High Lords. Frustration painted those Tyrant faces. The hall was so quiet that Rand could hear himself breathe. "This belongs to someone else," he said finally. "Besides, I've spent too long in the saddle to welcome such a hard seat. Bring me a comfortable chair." There was a moment of shocked silence before a murmur ran through the hall. Mylan suddenly wore such a look of speculation, quickly suppressed, that Rand nearly laughed. Very likely Osmodian was right about the man. Osmodian himself was eyeing Rand with barely hidden surmise. It was some minutes before the fellow in the star-embroidered coat ran up panting, followed by 2 dark-liveried Cairhienan, carrying a high-backed chair piled with silk-covered cushions, and pointed out where to place it with a great many worried glances at Rand. Vertical lines of gilt ran up the chair's heavy legs and back, but it seemed insignificant in front of the Sun Throne. While the 3 servants were still bowing themselves away, bending double on every step, Rand tossed most of the cushions to one side and sat down gratefully, the Seanchan spearhead on his head. He was careful not to sigh, though. Aviendha was watching him too carefully for that, and the way Samara kept glancing from her to him and back confirmed his suspicions. But whatever his problems with Aviendha and Farder Eyes Mai, most present awaited his words with equal parts eagerness and trepidation. At least they'll jump when I say toad, he thought. They might not like it, but they would do it. With Moraine's help, he had worked out what he must do here. Some he had known was right even without her suggestions. It would have been good to have her there to whisper in his ear if needed, instead of Aviendha waiting to signal Samara. But there was no point in waiting. Surely every tyrant and Cairhienin noble in the city was in this chamber. He said loudly, and the crowd of nobles shifted, exchanging confused glances. Tyrants came to help, but that is no reason for Cairhienin to hold themselves in the rear here. Let everyone sort themselves by rank. Everyone. It was difficult to say whether Tyrants or Cairhienin were the most stunned, though Mylan looked ready to swallow his tongue, and the other 6 not far behind. Even slow-burning Aracom went white in the face. With much shuffling of boots and twitching aside of skirts, with many icy stares on both sides, it was done, until the front rows were all men and women with stripes across, and the second held only a few Tyrants. Mylan and his fellows had been joined at the foot of the dais.
Hey, V-Woo, how you doing?
Cairhienin lords and ladies.
Hope you're doing good.
Most graying, and everyone stripes from neck nearly to knees, though perhaps joined was not the right word. In 2 groups, a full 3 paces between, and looked away from one another so hard that they might as well have shaken fists and shouted. Every eye was on Rand, and if the Tyrants were in a fury, the Cairhienin were still ice, with only hints of a thaw in the considering way they studied him. I have noticed the banners flying above Cairhien, he went on, once the movement stilled. It is well that so many of the crescents of Tyr fly. Iron grain, Cairhien would have no living to hoist a banner. And without tyrant swords, the people of this city who survive today, noble as well as common, would be learning to obey the Shah.
I'm not doing too bad. I can't
Tyr
complain,
has
though.
earned her honor. That puffed up the tyrants, of course, bringing fierce nods and fiercer smiles, though it certainly seemed to confuse the High Lords, coming on the heels of
How you? How you been
For
doing?
that matter, the Cairhienin below the dais were eyeing one another doubtfully. But I do not need so many banners for myself. Let one dragon banner remain on the highest tower of the city so all who approach can see. But let the rest be taken down and replaced with the banners of Cairhien. This is Cairhien, and the rising sun must and will fly proudly. Cairhien has her own honor, which she shall keep. The chamber erupted in a roar so suddenly that maidens hefted their spears, a roar that reverberated from wall to wall. In an instant, Sulin was flashing maiden hand talk, but already half-raised veils were being let fall. The Cairhienin nobles were cheering every bit as loudly as the people in the streets had, capering and waving their arms like foregaters at festival. In the pandemonium, it was the Tyrants' turn to exchange silent stares. They did not look angry. Even Mylan appeared unsure more than anything else, though like Torian and the others, he watched in amazement the lords and ladies of high rank around him, so coldly dignified a moment before, now dancing and shouting for the Lord Dragon. Rand did not know what any of them read into his words. Certainly he had expected them to hear more than he said, especially the Cairhienin, and perhaps even that some would hear what he really meant. But nothing had prepared him for this display. Cairhienin reserve was an odd thing he well knew, mixed at times with unexpected boldness. Moraine had been reticent on the matter, for all her insistence on trying to teach him everything. The most she had said was that if that reserve broke, it could do so to a surprising degree. Surprising indeed. When the cheering finally died down, the giving of oaths of fealty began. Mylan was the first to kneel, tight-faced as he pledged under the light and by his hope of salvation and rebirth to serve faithfully and obey. It was an old form, and Rand hoped it might actually constrain some to keep the oath. Once Mylan had kissed the tip of the Seanchan spearhead, trying to hide a sour grimace by stroking his beard, he was replaced by the Lady Colliver. A more than handsome woman in her middle years, with dark ivory lace spilling over the hands she placed between Rand's, and horizontal slashes of color from high lace collar to her knees, she gave the oath in a clear, firm voice and the musical accent he was used to hearing from Moraine. Her dark gaze had something of the weighing and measuring look of Moraine as well, most especially when she eyed Avienda as she curtsied her way back down the steps. Torian replaced her, sweating as he
Just
swore.
looking for
and
something to throw on
Lord
TV
Dobrin
real
replaced
quick.
Torian, deep-set eyes probing, one of the few older men to have shaved the front of his long, mostly gray hair. Then Aracone, and... Rand felt impatience as the procession continued, one by one up to kneel before him, Karienen succeeding Tyron, succeeding Karienen, as he had decreed. This was all necessary, so Moraine said, and so agreed a voice in his head that he knew for Lews Therins. But to him, it was part of the delay. He must have their loyalty, if only on the surface, in order to begin making Carrion secure. And that beginning, at least, had to be made before he could move on Samael. And that I will do. I have too much to do yet to let him go on stabbing at my ankles from the bushes.
Trying to and smoking ball at the same time.
To rouse the dragon. He did not understand why those coming before him.
Not like I got the volume on when I have a movie on. It's just
stammered the words of feeling.
something going on in the background that I could
he could not see the cold light
zone out on as I'm
burning in
listening
his
to the
own
book. But
Chapter 47. The Price of a Ship. Finishing her morning wash, Nynaeve toweled herself dry and pulled on a fresh silk shift.
testing out my
reluctantly.
new GoPro
Silk was
too.
not as cool as linen, and even with the sun only just
Couldn't
up, the heat in the wagon
pass it up
foretold
for the
another
price.
scorching day. Besides which, the thing was
The
cut, so
that
she was
place
half
had it on
afraid it
sale
would fall
for
in a puddle around her ankles if she breathed wrong. At least
under
it was
$200
not damp with
so
night sweat, as her discarded one
I
was.
ended up getting it.
Disturbing dreams had racked her sleep, dreams of Mogadine that woke her bolt upright, and those better than the ones she did not wake out of. Dreams of Brigitte shooting arrows at her and not missing. Dreams of the Prophet's followers rioting through the menagerie, of being stranded forever in Samara because no vessel ever came, of reaching Salidar and finding Elida in charge, or Mogadine again there too. She had wakened weeping from that one. All just worry, of course, and natural enough. 3 nights camped here without a ship appearing, 3 sweltering days of standing blindfolded against that cursed piece of wall. That was enough to put anyone
trying
on
to
edge,
find something
even
that
without worrying whether
I
Mogadine
haven't
was
seen
closing
a
in.
dozen times.
But then, just because the woman
Which
knew
is,
they were with a menagerie did not mean she had to find them in Samara.
A tad difficult
There were other
sometimes.
traveling menageries in the world besides those gathered here. Thinking up reasons not to worry was easier than not worrying, though. But why should I be anxious about Egwene? Dipping a split
And then
twig
especially
into a small
horror
dish of
movies,
salt
'cause
and
that's usually
soda
what I
on the
watch is
washstand, she began scrubbing her
horror
teeth
movies is
vigorously.
what I've always
Egwene had popped up in nearly every
watched
dream,
since I was a
yammering
kid.
at her, but she could not see how Egwene
and I've
turned into
seen
her.
everything from the oldest
In
to the
truth,
newest text
anxiety and
ones.
lack of sleep were only part of what made her mood vile this morning. The others were such minor things, but they were realities. A pebble in your shoe was small compared to having your head cut off, but if the pebble was there,
To where
and the
I
chopping
watched,
block might never be, it was not possible
old
to
movie,
avoid her
I
own
think it's,
reflection,
was it
and her hair
Nosferatu?
hanging loose about her
I
shoulders
think that one
instead
was
of decently braided. Brush it how she
1922.
would, the brassy
and it
red
was
color
in
never
the
became less loathsome.
Silent
And she
movie.
knew all too well
era.
that a blue dress was laid out on the bed behind her. A blue to make even a tinker woman blink, and cut as low as the original red gown hanging on a peg. That was why she had on this precariously clinging
And
shirt.
I've seen
One dress like that was not
tons
enough,
and tons.
not according to Valen Luca. Clarine was at work
I think
on
the
another
oldest
pair
ones
in a
are,
virulent
like I said,
yellow, and there
Nosferatu,
was
which is
talk
like
of
silent movie
stripes.
era.
Nynaeve did
The
not want to
original
know about stripes.
Dracula with Bela
At least
Lugosi.
the man could let me choose the
The
colors,
original
she
Wolfman.
thought, working the split twig
Swamp Thing.
furiously. Or Clarine. But no,
All those
he
old
had his
black
own
and white
ideas
ones.
and he never asked. Not Valen Luca. His color choices sometimes made her forget the necklines. I ought to throw it in his face. Yet she knew she would not. Birgitta flaunted herself in those dresses without the hint of a blush. The woman was certainly nothing like any of the stories about her. Not that she was going to wear the fool dress without protest because Birgitta did. She was not competing with the woman in any way. It was just that, if you have to do a thing, she growled around the twig, best you get used to it. What did you say? Elaine asked. If you're going to talk, please take that out of your mouth. The noise is disgusting otherwise. Wiping her chin, Nynaeve glared over her shoulder. Elaine was seated on her own narrow bed with her legs drawn up beside her, braiding her black-dyed hair. She already had on her white breeches, all sewn with spangles, and a snowy silk blouse with ruffles at the neck that was much too sheer. Her sequin-splattered white coat lay beside her. White. She also had 2 suits of clothes for performing, with a third in the making, all in white, if not exactly plain.
Right.
If you are going to dress in that fashion, Elaine, you should not sit so. It's indecent. The other woman glowered sullenly, but she did put her slippered feet on the floor, and raised her chin in that haughty way she had. I think I may take a walk into the town this morning, she said coolly, still working at the braid. This wagon is confining. Rinsing her mouth, Nynaeve spat into the washbowl, loudly. The wagon certainly did seem smaller by the day. Maybe they did need to keep out of sight as much as possible. It had been her idea, one she was coming to regret, but this was becoming ridiculous. 3 days shut up with Elaine, except when they went to perform, was beginning to feel like 3 weeks, or 3 months. She had never before realized what an acid tongue Elaine had. A ship had to come. Any kind of ship. She would give every last coin hidden in the brick stove, every last jewel, anything for a ship today. Well, that wouldn't attract any attention, would it? But perhaps you could use the exercise. Or maybe it's just the way those breeches fit your hips. Blue eyes flared, but Elaine's chin remained high and her tone cold. I dreamed about Egwene last night, and between going on about Rand and Kyrian, I worry about what is happening there, even if you do not. In between, she said you were turning into a screaming harridan. Not that I think so, necessarily. I would have said a fishmonger. Now you listen to me, you ill-tempered little chit. If you don't... Still glaring, Nynaeve snapped her mouth shut, then drew breath slowly. With an effort, she forced her voice to be level. You dreamed about Egwene? Elaine nodded curtly. And she talked of Rand and Kyrian? The younger woman rolled her eyes in exaggerated exasperation and went on with her braid. Nynaeve made her hand loose its fistful of brassy red hair, made herself stop thinking of teaching the daughter heir of bloody Andor some simple common courtesy. If they did not find a ship soon... If you can think of anything except how to show more of your legs than you already are, it might interest you to know that she was in my dreams too. She said Rand won a great victory at Kyrian yesterday. I may be exposing my legs, Elaine barked, spots of color rising in her cheeks. But at least I am not flashing my... You dreamed of her too? It did not take long to compare notes, though Elaine continued to show a viperish tongue. Nynaeve had had a perfectly good reason for screaming at Egwene, and Elaine probably had been dreaming of parading in front of Rand in her sequined costume, if not less. Saying so was simple honesty. Even so, it quickly became clear that Egwene had said the same things in both their dreams, and that left little room for doubt. She kept saying she was really there, Nynaeve muttered, but I thought it was just part of the dream. Egwene had told them often enough that it was possible, talking to someone in her dreams, but she had never said that she could. Why should I have believed? I mean, she said she finally recognized some spear he's taken to carry as Shan work.
Influence Freddie.
Of course. Elaine arched one eyebrow in an irritating manner.
Why not
Just as preposterous as
someone
finding
based it off
Sarandon and her
a couple
Swiftly.
different serial
There
killers,
must be other Shan refugees,
like they've
Nynaeve,
done with a couple
and
of
spears
the
are likely the least of
horror
what they
movies.
left behind. Why could the woman not say anything without a barb? I notice how well you behaved. Elaine threw the finished braid over her shoulder, then tossed her head again, superciliously, for good measure. "I do hope Rand is all right." Nynaeve sniffed. Egwene had said he would need days of rest before he was on his feet again, but he had been healed. The other woman continued. "No one ever taught him he must himself. Doesn't he know the power can kill him if he draws too much, or weaves when
I'll be
tired?
right back.
That much is the same for him as for us." So she meant to change the subject, did she? "Perhaps he doesn't know," Nynaeve told her sweetly, "since there isn't a white tower for men." That made her think of something else. "Do you think it really was Samael?" Caught with a retort on the tip of her tongue, Elaine glowered at her sideways, then he... "It hardly matters to us, does it? What we should be thinking about is using the ring again. For more than meeting Egwene, there is so much to learn. The more I do learn, the more I know how much I don't know yet." No. Nynaeve did not really expect the other woman to take out the ring ter'angreal then and there, but she took a reflexive step toward the brick stove. No more trips to Tel Rhiod for either of us, except to meet her. Elaine went right on without appearing to notice. Nynaeve could have been talking to herself. "It isn't as though we need to channel. We won't give ourselves away that way." She did not look at Nynaeve, but there was a hint of bite in her voice. She maintained that they could use the power if they were careful. For all Nynaeve knew, Elaine did just that behind her back. "I'll wager that if one of us visited the Heart of the Stone tonight, Egwene would be there. Think, if we could talk to her in her dreams, we'd not need to worry about encountering Mogadin in Tel Rhiod any longer." "You think it's easy to learn, then?" Nynaeve asked dryly. "If that's so, why hasn't she taught us already? Why hasn't she done it before this?" Her heart was not in it, though. She was the one worried about Mogadin. Elaine knew the woman was dangerous, but it was like knowing a viper was dangerous. Elaine knew, but Nynaeve had been bitten. And being able to communicate without entering the world of dreams would be valuable quite aside from avoiding Mogadin. In any case, Elaine still was paying no attention to her. "I wonder why she was so insistent we not tell anyone. That makes no sense. Then, last time she spoke to me, she vanished in mid-sentence. What I remember now is that before she did, she suddenly looked surprised and frightened." Nynaeve took a deep breath and pressed both hands hard against her stomach, in a vain effort to quiet sudden flutters. She managed to keep her voice flat, though. "Mogadin? Light, you do have cheerful thoughts." "No."
And then,
If
what I like
Mogadin
even
could
more
come into our
about this
dreams,
time of year
I think we
is
would know it by now. Elaine gave a small shiver. She did have some idea of how dangerous Mogadin was.
the
Anyway, it wasn't that sort of look.
movies.
She was frightened.
All the good
but not
movies
enough
come
for
out
that.
this time of year.
Then maybe she isn't in any danger. Maybe... Forcing her hands to her sides, Nynaeve compressed her lips angrily. Only she was not certain who she was angry with. Putting the ring away out of sight, except for meetings with Egwene, had been a good idea. It had. Any venture into the world of dreams could have found Mogadin, and keeping clear of her was better than a good idea. She already knew she was overmatched. That thought rankled, worse every time she had it, but it was the simple truth. Yet now there was the chance that Egwene needed help, a small chance. Just because she was properly wary of Mogadin did not mean she was underrating the possibility. And it might be that Rand had one of the Forsaken after him in the same personal way that Mogadin was after her and Elaine. What Egwene reported, both of Cairhien and of the mountains, smacked of one man daring another to knock a chip off his shoulder. Not that she could see anything to do about that. But Egwene... Sometimes it seemed to Nynaeve that she had forgotten why she had left the Two Rivers in the first place. To protect young people from her village who had been caught in Aes Sedai webs. Not that much younger than herself, only a few years. Yet the gap seemed wider when you were the village wisdom. Of course, the women's circle in Emond's Field had certainly chosen a new wisdom by now, but that did not make it less her village or them less her people. In her heart of hearts, it made her no less the wisdom. Somehow, though, Protecting Rand and Egwene and Mat and Perrin from Aes Sedai had become helping them survive, and finally, without her quite realizing when or how, even that goal had been submerged in other needs. Entering the White Tower to learn how better to pull down Moiraine had become a burning desire to learn how to heal. Even her hatred for Aes Sedai meddling in people's lives now coexisted with her desire to become one. Not that she really wanted to, but it was the only way to learn what she wanted to learn. Everything had become as tangled as one of those Aes Sedai webs, herself included, and she did not know how to escape. I am still who I have always been. I will help them as much as I can. Tonight, she said aloud, I will use the ring. Sitting down on the bed, she began to pull on her stockings. Stout wool was hardly comfortable in this heat, but at least part of her would be decently clothed. Stout stockings and stout shoes. Birgitte wore brocaded slippers and gossamer silk stockings that still looked cool. She put the thought out of her head. Just as she Egwene is in the stone. If she isn't, I will come back, and we won't use the ring again until the next scheduled meeting. Elaine watched her with
a nice little
stare that made her tug at her stockings in increasing discomfort. The woman did not say a word, but her expressionless gaze implied that Nynaeve might be lying. To Nynaeve it did. It did not help that the thought had flittered on the edge of consciousness, that she could easily make sure the ring was not touching her skin when she went to sleep. There was no real reason to believe that Egwene would be waiting in the heart of the stone tonight. She had never really considered it. The thought had just been hidden, but it had been there, and she to meet Elaine's eyes. What if she was afraid of Moghedien? It was only good sense, however it gone.
And what the trip is,
I will do
the size difference from
she
this one to my,
butterflies
this is,
by the time she tossed the shift down over her
Luca
stockings, she was eager to don the blue
Dragon
dress
Egg
and go out into the heat, just to escape Elaine's eyes. Elaine was just finishing helping her with the rows of small buttons up the back, and muttering that no one
and
could help
this
her,
is my
as if anyone needed help with
Dr.
bridges,
Dabber switch.
when the wagon door
And the
banged
size
open,
difference.
letting in a wave of hot air. Startled, Nynaeve jumped and covered her bosom with both hands before she could stop herself. When Birgitte climbed in instead of veiling
This is
with
more
her, she tried to pretend she was adjusting
be able to take on the
neckline.
road with you.
Smoothing identical brilliant blue
This one you
silk over
can,
her
but you
head,
gotta pack
the
it away.
taller woman pulled
This
her
one,
thick black
not so
braid
much,
over
where you
one
can actually
bare shoulder with a
do it,
self-pleased
dab in the
grin.
car with no problem.
If you want to draw attention,
If you wanted
don't
to.
bother fiddling. It
Not
is
that
too
I'm,
obvious. Just
Telling anyone
breathe
to do that
deep.
while they're driving.
She demonstrated, then laughed at
I'm
Nynaeve's
doing it because
scowl.
I'm not driving.
Nynaeve
I'm the
made an
passenger.
effort to keep her temper, though why she should, she did not know. She could hardly imagine that she had felt guilt over what had happened. Gadel Kane was probably glad to get away from the woman, and Birgitte got to wear her hair the way she wanted. Not that that had anything to do with anything. I knew someone like you in the Two Rivers, Marion. Calla knew every merchant's guard by his first name, and she certainly had no secrets from any of them. Birgitte's smile tightened. And I knew a woman like you once. Mathena looked down her nose at men, too, and even had a poor fellow executed for coming on her by accident while she swam naked. She'd never even been kissed until Jerry's stole one from her. You'd have thought she had discovered men for the first time. She became so besotted, Jerry's had to go live on a mountain to escape her. Watch out for the first man to kiss you. One has to come along sooner or later. Fists clenching, Nynaeve took a step toward her, or tried to. Somehow Elaine was in between them, hands upraised. "Both of you stop it this minute," she said, eyeing them in turn with equal haughtiness. "Lini always said waiting turns men into bears in a barn and women into cats in a sack, but you will stop clawing at one another
It's
right now. I
a
will not put up with
Luca
it any longer."
Dragon Egg.
To Nynaeve's
And they come in
surprise,
different colors.
Birgitte
This
actually
is like,
blushed and
well, if I
mumbled
had a
silent
regular light, you'd be able to
apology.
tell the
To
color
Elaine,
better,
of
but
course, but the apology
this is more
itself
like a
was the
grayish
surprise.
silver. They have
Birgitte
like a
had
black
chosen to
one,
stay
a red
close to
one.
Elaine, There was no
and
need for
several
her
other
to hide,
different color
but after
ones.
3 days, the heat was
But
apparently
they're
affecting
under
her as badly
100,
as it did Elaine.
so that's a good
For
thing.
herself, Nynaeve gave the daughter heir her frostiest stare. She'd
I don't
managed to
mind it so
maintain
much.
an even disposition while they waited, cooped up together. She had, but Elaine certainly had no room to talk. "Now," Elaine said, still in that icy tone, "did you have some reason for barging in like a bull, or have you simply forgotten how to knock?" Nynaeve opened her mouth to say something about cats, just a gentle reminder, but Brigitte forestalled her, if in a tighter voice. "Tom and Jewelin are back from the town." "Back?" Nynaeve exclaimed, and Brigitte glanced at her before returning to Elaine. "You did not send them?" "I did not," Elaine said grimly. She was out of the door, Brigitte at her heels, before Nynaeve could say a word. There was nothing for it but to follow, grumbling to herself. Elaine had better not suddenly think she was the one giving orders. Nynaeve had still not forgiven her for revealing so much to the men. The dry heat seemed even worse outside, for all the sun still sat on the canvas wall around the menagerie. Sweat popped out on her brow before she reached the foot of the ladder, but for once she did not grimace. The two men sat on three-legged stools beside the cook fire, hair wild and coats looking as if they had rolled in the dirt. A trickle of red ran from beneath a wadded cloth Tom was pressing to his scalp, down across a fan of dried blood that covered his cheek and stained one long white mustache. A purple lump the size of a hen's egg stood out beside Jewelin's eye, and he held his thumb-thick staff of pale ridged wood in a hand roughly wrapped with a bloody bandage. That ridiculous conical red cap, sitting on the back of his head, appeared to have been trampled. From the noises inside the canvas walls, the horse handlers were already at work cleaning cages, and no doubt Sarandon was with her Sredit. None of the men would go near them. But there was relatively little stir around the wagons as yet. Petra was smoking his long-stemmed pipe while he helped Clarine prepare their breakfast. Two of the Chavanas were studying some piece of apparatus, with Muellen, the contortionist, while the other pair were chatting with two of the 6 female acrobats Luca had hired away from Cilia Serrano's show. They claimed to be sisters named Murasaka, despite being even more disparate in looks and coloring than the Chavanas. One of the pair, lounging in colorful silk robes with Brug and Teorik, had blue eyes and almost white hair. The other's skin nearly as dark as her eyes. Everyone else was already garbed for the day's first performance, the men bare-chested in colorful breeches, Muellen in gauzy red and a tight-matching vest, Clarine in high-necked green sequins. Tom and Jewelin attracted a few looks, but fortunately no one thought it necessary to come inquire after their health. Perhaps it was the hangdog way they sat, shoulders slumped,
And then
eyes
it
on the
has
ground under their boots.
3 temp settings.
Doubtless they knew they were in for a tongue lashing that would sear their hides. Nynaeve certainly intended to give them one. Elaine, though, gasped at the sight of them and went running to kneel beside Tom, all the anger of a moment before taking wing. "What happened? Oh, Tom, your poor head. That must hurt so. Beyond my abilities. Nynaeve will take you inside and see to it. Tom, you are too old to get yourself into scrapes like this."
Hey,
Indignantly,
D-man,
he
how you
fended her
doing,
off
bro?
as best he could while holding his compress in place. "Good child. I've had worse than this, falling out of bed. Will you leave over?" Nynaeve was not about to do any healing, despite being
That might be,
angry enough. She planted herself in
It used
front
to
of
be better
Jewelin,
streaming,
fists on her hips, and
during
a
the Diamond
no
Painting. Now
nonsense
that I got,
answer right now look on her face.
my new,
What do you mean,
I actually got a
sneaking off without
GoPro
telling
now
me? As well to
that I can
start
actually
letting
live
Elaine know
stream
that
from,
she
so I can
was
actually
not in
set it up
charge.
better.
If you had gotten your throat cut instead of a mouse on your eye, how would we know what had happened to you? There was no reason for you to go. None. Finding a ship has been seen to. Jewelin glared up at her, shoving his cap forward over his forehead.
Oh shit.
Seen to?
Hell yeah, how did it go,
Is
D-man?
that why the three
Hope
of you
it went
have
well.
taken to stalking about like... He cut off as Tom groaned loudly and swayed. Once the old gleeman had quieted Elaine's concerned flutters with protestations that it had just been a momentary fear, that he was fit to attend a ball, and given Julian a significant glance he obviously hoped the women would not see, Nynaeve turned a dangerous eye back to the dark Tyran, remembering just what it was he thought they had been stalking about like. "A good thing we did go," he told her instead, in a tight voice. "Samara's a school of silverpike around a chunk of bloody meat. There are mobs on every street hunting dark friends, and anybody else who isn't ready to hail the Prophet as the one true voice of the Dragon Reborn." "It started 3 hours or so ago near the river," Tom put in, giving in with a sigh to Elaine's bathing his face with a damp cloth. He appeared to be ignoring her mutters, which must have taken some doing, since Nynaeve could clearly hear, "Foolish old man," and "Need someone to take care of you before you get yourself killed," among other things, in a tone easily as exasperated as it was fond. "How it
Hell yeah,
began, I
D-man.
don't know. I heard Aes Sedai blamed, White
That's
Cloaks,
good to hear.
Trollocs, everybody but the Seanchan, and if they knew the name, they'd blame them too." He winced at Elaine's pressure. "The last hour we were a little too personally involved
That was
in
an empty
getting
bowl.
clear to learn much." "There are fires," Brigitte said. Petra and his wife noticed her pointing and stood to stare worriedly. 2 dark plumes of smoke rose above the canvas wall in the direction of the town.
All right,
Julian
everyone.
rose and looked Nynaeve in the eyes with a hard gaze. "It is time to go. Maybe we'll stand out enough for Mogadeen to find us, but I doubt
I'm
it.
gonna have
There
to
are people running
call
every
into
direction
this
they
life
can
for
run.
right now.
In another 2 hours, it won't be
But
a
I'll
pair
get
of
back
fires,
on
it will
in
be
here
50.
and
And avoiding her won't do much good
just
if
a
we're torn
second.
to pieces by a mob. They'll turn to the shows
Or
once
try
they've
to,
smashed what can
anyways.
be smashed in the town. Don't use that name.
Just that my
Nynaeve
my
said
GoPro's
sharply,
about to go
with a
dead,
frown
so
for Elaine that the younger woman did not
I gotta
see.
end it on my
Letting
GoPro,
men know too
charge
much
it
was
out, then
always a
I'm gonna
mistake.
get on it on
The
my
trouble was he was right.
laptop real
But letting
quick.
a man know that
So,
too quickly was a mistake
Just bear with
too.
me for a sec.